Of course it is. Of course you are. So I would like us to mainly focus on one area of the dictatorship, which was censorship.
Okay.
Because in the Portuguese dictatorship, that was so ambivalent and it was permeated in all the facets of art production. And so mainly, I think I would like us to discuss how the process of art production from within such a strict sensorial status, how is it possible to produce art, which is a free expression, which is the expression of your most inner feelings in a way, and how is it possible to do that within a restrictive, within a prison? Because literally your fantasy, your capacity to create was imprisoned. So how do we, if we would like to elaborate on that?
Okay. Well, first, before I respond to that question and that idea about censorship, I just want to thank the organizers of today's meeting. I'm very grateful to Deolinda, who's always been a big support and who does fantastic work out there in California, serving as a bridge between Portuguese culture and American culture, which is something that I do too, something we all do. I'd like to thank Jeroen for being the overarching supervisor of all these wonderful programs, and Duarte for helping, especially with the technological aspects. It wasn't that easy to get on. I thought for a minute there that my IQ had been lowered by 50 points in just 2 minutes because I couldn't seem to do it. But here I am, and I'm glad to be here. So before I reply to Deolinda's statements, I just want to say happy 25th of April to everyone, the Carnation Revolution. So I've got my little carnation here. It's a day we all celebrate in Portugal and in Portuguese speaking countries around the world, because as Deolinda has just said, it means the end of censorship and the end of repression and a chance to start over and to build a new country. Censorship in Portugal. Obviously, it goes without saying, although Americans don't have much of an experience with the dictatorship, I think people can understand that all newspapers and all publishing houses and magazines and television had supervisory officers responsible for controlling a lot of the content of news reports and articles. And so censorship was very strong in Portugal. People, when you grow up in a country where there's censorship, you do a lot of self-censorship as well, because you grow to learn what can be said and what can't be said, what's going to get you punished and what's not going to get you punished. And I know from my friends who lived in Portugal before the revolution, and that people used all sorts of subversive measures to try to get around this. So in their articles and newspapers, they used a kind of coded language to refer to events and people and places so that they couldn't get in trouble, but could try to transmit that information. As Deolinda said, obviously all forms of censorship end up destroying a lot of artwork, because if you can't speak about your deepest feelings and emotions and hopes and desires and fears, then you really can't write the books, the poetry, the prose that you want to. I'll give one brief example. I don't want to out anyone, but I had a friend who was an elderly poet and who grew up in Portugal in the 1940s and 1950s, and he was gay. But if you read his poems, you'll never see any references to love for men or to affection for men. So what he did, his way around the censorship, was to make everything, I guess we'd call non-gender specific at this point, or would use a woman's name. And he really had no other choice, because if you're trying to publish poetry of a gay or lesbian or non-binary nature back in Portugal in the 1960s, it was never going to happen. And you could get in big trouble and you would not be read. So obviously that was not an option for him. And I think people discovered that they didn't have options. And that's one of the reasons why the revolution was so important, and why it's witnessed such a blossoming of literature. To end my first statement, I would say that very few people that I know in Portugal read novels written in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. Of course, there are classic books that people read. People even still read Essa de Queiroz. I'm not against that. I think that's wonderful. But I think that since the revolution, there's been a blossoming of novels and poetry, and most people in Portugal would read that, I think, because they can finally read people expressing themselves, expressing their deepest emotions and desires and hopes.
Thank you, Richard. I do tend to agree with you, although there is some interest in a body of literature that was produced specifically under those restraints.
Absolutely.
And how the artists, as well with pictographic art, the choice, and the cinema as well.
Absolutely.
We find some little, even in the most traditional Portuguese films, such as Leão da Estrela and those, we find these very subtle criticisms to the regime that somehow made it through, which is really interesting. What I would like us to carry forward is what you just spoke about. You just spoke about that after the 25th of April, there was this onslaught of literary production that came out and blossomed. My question addresses, to what extent do writers still practice, and for a few years after the revolution and after those initial boom, to what extent do writers still incorporate and practice that self-censorship that you are speaking about? I have friends who say, oh, I'm afraid my readers will find this too scandalous. I'm afraid my readers, especially female writers, have that issue. I would like to speak of that, of how much remains of how much of the censorship becomes part of you without you even realizing it.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, because those of us who have experience in America and Portugal will notice one glaring difference, I think, and let's see if Deolinda and Duarte and the others agree with me, which is in America, for instance, after the Vietnam War, we had an explosion of literature and films, all sorts of artistic expression, reevaluating what that war meant. Was it immoral? Was it righteous? Everything from very right-wing Rambo saying, America's war was a heroic adventure and we should have won it, and Vietnamese were horrible, all the way to Oliver Stone and to many, many books written by former military people denouncing the war as just a total waste of time and the destruction of an entire country that cost 1 million Vietnamese lives and 58,000 American lives. I mention that because in Portugal, we don't have that same expression. There are very, very few books written about the colonial wars in Africa. I mean, we can cite Antonio Lobo Antunes as one of the few who wrote very directly and very openly about those wars and those conflicts. But there's very few other films. The few films and books there are, they use the colonial experience not to discuss necessarily the war, but to discuss what growing up in Mozambique or Angola meant to them and coming to the continent, how that changed them, the difficulty of adapting to continental Portugal after growing up in Africa. So I think that there's a kind of self-censorship that exists in Portuguese culture without even people being aware of it. which is that we don't write about our past. And I grew aware of this when I wrote The Last Kabbalist of Lisbon, my first novel, which is about a terrible event in Portuguese history, the Lisbon Massacre of 1506, in which 2,000 forcibly converted Jews were murdered and burnt in the main square in Lisbon in the Rocio. And it's a long story, but I won't tell it. But after publishing it, a lot of journalists asked me, well, how is it possible that a foreigner wrote about this absolutely central, horrific crime against humanity in Portugal, and no Portuguese author born here ever wrote about it? And I would say it's because, well, two things. One, I'm not afraid of the Portuguese past. I'm not afraid of discussing how things were. I think it's really very important to discuss what went wrong in the past. I sometimes say that the right side of history is always the side that has a memory. And I use that to write my books. And the second reason is, and we can talk about this if you want, I think Portuguese people have an inferiority complex, and they tend to believe that nothing of any interest ever happened here except for the explorers, Vasco da Gama and Magellan, or maybe a little bit of Fernando Pessoa. It's okay to talk about those two topics, but the rest of Portuguese history is boring and unimportant and nothing happened. And I don't have that inferiority complex in my head, so that for me, I find Portuguese history absolutely fascinating and wonderful and dramatic and amazing. And I don't have the self-censor in my head, so I'm always happy to write about it. In terms of other topics like sex, that's again a very difficult topic for the Portuguese to come to terms with. My women friends tell me, and I have to accept it because I don't feel it myself, that it remains a very male-oriented society, a very macho society. So that for women to write openly about their sexual lives or the sexual lives of their mothers and grandmothers, I think amongst a lot of people would still be considered a taboo or something that you could only do extremely delicately. And the third part of this that I want to mention is that there's a new form of censorship coming up that I, as a writer, find particularly difficult, which has to do with identity politics. And the idea that if you're not, I'll use myself an example, if you're not a Jewish gay writer living in Portugal, you shouldn't be able to write about Jewish gay topics in Portugal. And if you're a Black woman, you should only, that white men should never write from the point of view of a Black woman or from an Asian character. And I have a great deal of trouble with that because I think that one of the beauties of writing is empathy. And I think that empathy is probably the most important human emotion and human capacity. And if we stifle that empathy in writers and censor them, we're losing a great deal of our humanity. Now, of course, I believe that obviously Black, lesbian women and Asian men and non-binary, they should all be able to express themselves and write their own books, make their own movies, sing their own songs. But I don't think that others should be prevented from entering into the bodies of whoever they want and writing from their perspective.
Thank you, Richard. Again, there is still one more form of censorship we haven't spoken about, and that is of particular importance to Portuguese writers. Again, especially women writers, or let me just put it this way, non-straight male writers. Is that delicate enough? And that is the censorship that is imposed by publishers.
Yeah, absolutely.
The publishing world in Portugal is quite limited. Portuguese public is not the most avid reading public in the world. And I'm not even talking about poetry, which is even more difficult. Even prize-winning poets have difficulty finding publishers.
Absolutely.
But I'm in general, how conscious are all of you who are producing work in Portugal? How conscious of it are you when in the writing process, in the creative process
Yeah.
of, if I write this, which is coming to me, I can't publish it.
Yeah. Oh, well, I would say that's not just a problem in Portugal, that's universal.
Right, but Portugal is sort of a micro.
Yes,
And
because it's so small, it may be more
right.
difficult in some sense because there's so few publishers.
And so few readers.
And so few readers, exactly. The publishing industry has always been very commercial and is even more commercial now, in part because these big groups have taken over. And if you have a group which has many vice presidents and directors, you need to make more profits. And so there's a very strong emphasis on publishing those books that are going to sell well and make the company profits. Now, if you happen to be an author that's writing, let's say, lesbian poetry or Afro-Luso novel about someone growing up in Cape Verde, you might have difficulties not necessarily because of racism or homophobia, although it's subtle, but because they say, oh, a lesbian poet, come on, she's not going to sell more than 300 copies. A Cape Verdean novel about a poor kid growing up in, Boa Vista who can't get there's no audience. And so the lack of readership, it's like a vicious circle leading into a more and more commercial emphasis for publishers. So there is censorship. They want very commercial projects. And obviously, they don't have crystal balls either. So they don't know what's going to sell and win prizes. So they're all just guessing based on the past what's going to sell well. And that's why we have what I call so many clones. If a book about vampires sells well, then we have 500 books about vampires. If zombies are in fashion, zombies. Books now with Auschwitz in the title sell well. So I always joke that I'm going to write Bacalhau de Auschwitz, the codfish of Auschwitz, because that'll sell well. And I'm only slightly joking because that's how commercial the market has become. And so, yes, amongst writers, there's also the idea that if you, let's say, come out of the closet and you're open about being married to a man or a woman being married to a woman, you might lose 10% of the readers. And so even in Portugal today, there's very few novelists who are out of the closet because they think, I'm going to lose 10% of my sales. Now, and they also think about it when they're starting a project. Should I be writing about two men who fall in love? Should I be writing about two women who start a farm together in the Alentejo? And probably the answer is no, because they're worried about getting published and selling. So there's censorship all the way along the line, and a lot of it is self-imposed. My way around that is I don't let anyone have an opinion about what I should write or shouldn't write. If I fall in love with a project, that's what I'm writing. And maybe that's stupid. It's probably a stupid way to have a strategy for my career, but it's the only way I can do it because I don't want outside influences. I don't want to think about the marketing campaign, the cover. I just want to write the best book I can. And if the characters happen to be gay or Afro-Luso or from other minority, that's the way it is, and there's nothing I can do about it. And then I hope that the publisher will publish it, and I hope that readers will buy it. And that's why when I do events, I always say to the people in the audience, if you want good books, and if you want publishers to keep publishing wonderful novels and wonderful poetry, you have to buy them. Because if they discover that you're not buying them, they're not going to publish them.
Correct. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. I would like to go back a little bit to what you discussed about the colonial war and things. I've always found that fascinating. If we really look at the 25 de Abril and what happened, although we understand that it was a middle military brass revolution in essence, it was very well accepted for the public in general. People refused to stay home. People were overjoyed. I can, for myself, speak of that. Although I was already living in the United States for almost 4 years by that time, I can say that that was the happiest day of my life. And my husband and children may be embarrassed by that or upset by that statement, but it still was, because it didn't just mean freedom and dignity for the Portuguese. It meant freedom and dignity for many more people around the globe. And that was also very important. And taking that into account, that it was, so we would say, a public sort of event, and or with wide public support. Then we have the phenomenon that, in general, Portugal's literature is very meta-literary. We're always mentioning other writers. We're always mentioning the past. There is a huge emphasis, and some of these historic novels sell a lot. Unfortunately, many of them with very poor research attached to them. And those seem to sell better, which is fascinating to me. So we are selling something that is a historical novel, but it's very fictionalized to the point that maybe the only thing that is there of history was the idea that sparked the whole thing. And that's fine, but to an extent, it's like, okay, but since we have this almost obsession with historical novels, and we have a revolution that is very accepted, that is widely accepted, we have a complete taboo about, I think we could count on the fingers of one hand the books written about the colonial war. We have Lídia Jorge, Costa dos Murmúrios, we have O Cu de Judas, and a couple of others more or less significant. Again, about the 25 de Abril directly, we have another handful of novels. We do have a few novels that are written about the 25 de Abril, but from a quite, we could consider, imperialist, saudosista perspective, with this whole ideology of this perfect Africa that was all beautiful and under control during Portuguese time, and then it just became total chaos after that, and which is for some of us extremely difficult to read, but seemed to sell well. So I get rave reviews. I am curious about how it, because you said, the Portuguese don't like to look at their past. And I do realize that the obsession with those two particular moments in history, particularly the explorations, because you can't discover something where people are already living. So it's a bit been done. So in any event, to me, that is also a construction of the regime. The regime emphasized that moment. It was their objective from the minute we have the Exposição do Mundo Português. So how much of that, how did the regime constructed us as Portuguese consumers of culture is still within all of us who go out to purchase culture. That was a long-winded explanation to get to that question.
That's a fascinating question about how the goals of a regime, even after it's ended, linger on in people's minds, and how they can free themselves from the constructs and the paradigms of a right-wing dictatorship, because it's so subtle in people's heads that they're not even aware of it. In all countries, you know America very well. I know Portugal and America and France. in all countries, we tend to focus on the most positive events. So there in America, we tend to view the expansion of European colonials into the West as this heroic, brave, wonderful adventure. You know, all the movies with John Wayne done by John Ford, where the Indians are the enemies, and
not to speak of the Alamo.
Yeah, the Alamo. Yeah, I mean, they're unwatchable today. I mean, they maybe people watched them in the 50s and didn't really understand what they were seeing. But in 2022, they're completely unwatchable, in my opinion. Now, in Portugal, something similar. We're allowed, the regime allowed people to focus on the explorations because that was supposedly Portugal's golden age. When Vasco da Gama went around to India and brought back all this exotic merchandise, and we had Goa and Diu and Damau, and people still have in their heads this idea of Goa, for instance, as this wonderful, exotic, tropical paradise where people could make their fortunes, and we could import this exotic, glorious, wonderful merchandise. And I wrote one novel called Goa, Guardian of the Dawn, which is set in Goa in the 17th century, because I wanted to talk about the real Goa, which was a religious dictatorship, the Inquisition there. Okay, it arrested Hindus who had been converted for offering a puja, offering a coconut to one of their gods or goddesses, and they would be tortured in prison, and they might be burnt at the stake. And this went on from 1560 all the way to 1812. Okay, so Goa was, if you want to think of Goa back then, think of Iran or Saudi Arabia now. It was a religious dictatorship where no one had any rights. And yes, if you were a wealthy merchant, you could make your fortune there, but that was 0.1% of the population. So we have all these fantasies in our head from the previous regime, from very badly written history books, from very badly written school books, and from terrible historical novels. We are all infiltrated with these ideas about these fantasy ideas, these lies about the way the Portuguese colonies were. And when I wrote Guardian of the Dawn, I discovered this in the worst way, because for the first time I got hate mail. I got hate mail from Goa, from people who refused to accept what the Inquisition did. There's all these crazy, sick people who deny that the Holocaust happened. Well, there's these crazy, sick people in India who deny that the Inquisition happened. So if you try to tell the non-official history of Portugal or anywhere else, you get in trouble. If you want to try to tell the history of a woman growing up in Portugal in 1930 who was prevented from having a bank account, who was prevented from getting the profession she wanted, who couldn't get an education, who maybe was mistreated by her husband, in years past, you would never get that published. And if you managed to get it published, you'd get a lot of hate mail. You'd be hated for giving a bad image of Portugal. And so I think that writers just have a responsibility to tell the non-official stories of their countries. And in Portugal, we still don't have that many people willing to do that. I'm not quite clear on why it's worse here. Maybe they still have the dictatorship in their head. Maybe they just want to sell a lot of books, and they know if they write a non-official history, they're not going to sell a lot of books. But it is a problem, and I wish the Portuguese would be able to free themselves more from this, because I think then we'd have a blossoming of really amazing literature and wonderful stories that never have been told about this country before.
So I know we're, so here we are 2 years away from the 50th anniversary, and we're still talking about some sort of censorship.
Yeah.
And you touched on a subject that I'm curious about, and that is the poor quality of, or on the fictional or the fictional portion of the official histories that are still being used in the school system.
Yeah.
And what, in your opinion, has prevented that in these 48 years that have elapsed, what has prevented them that those histories, those official histories,
Yeah.
be even slightly updated?
Well, I think that's a combination of factors. First of all, you have to have the willingness on the part of the Ministry of Education, on the part of the government, to invest in new books, to invest in someone writing a new history of Portuguese colonization. And that takes, a real concerted effort on the part of ministry officials and teachers and a budget. And I think that's happening now. I just did a Zoom the other day with teachers, and they said, for instance, that the Lisbon Massacre of 1506 is now being taught in the schools. I feel very proud about that, I think, because before my novel, no one would have talked about that. So I think I have contributed in some way to a little bit more justice. And so I think things are changing. I helped write a bit of a history, a world history for kids, and I wrote the little section on the Holocaust. And I think it came out really good for, not to scare people, but for kids who were 11 and 12 to understand what happened in Nazi Germany and in Europe during the Second World War. So I think it is changing slowly, probably not too fast, probably too slowly. We need to make it go faster, but things are changing. Things are getting better. I still see a great deal of ignorance, for instance, about the Inquisition. People still don't know what it was about, which is extraordinary to me because it continued in Portugal from 1536 all the way to the early 19th century. And to not know anything about how the Inquisition functioned and repressed people here, I find it absolutely extraordinary.
So I want to tell you a little secret. About 3 years ago, I did a little bit of a field experiment. And there's the monument to the Inquisition in front of the Igreja de São Domingos.
Yeah.
And I decided to ask people around there, pretend to be a tourist, know nothing about Lisbon. And I was asking people, what is this monument about?
Right.
Some of them bothered to go to it and try to read it, but most of them said, oh, this is where they began to build Lisbon. That was the main answer. This is where Lisbon began to be built in the ancient times. And these were people who were dwellers. Interestingly enough, the tourists who would say, oh, I don't know, I'm a tourist, but let me go check. Maybe we can find out together. And they would read it, and they figured it out. But the Lisboners didn't care to go read it. They just said, oh, this is where Lisbon started. This is the center.
Yeah.
And I found that to be extremely interesting.
And depressing.
Well, that too. But I just kind of, how would you react to that kind of information? What is that telling us? That somebody passes by something every single day.
Yeah.
And there is absolutely no mention of what these people believe that is. There is no way you could misread it.
Yeah. Well, I think we have to accept, we can fight against it, but we have to understand that most people aren't as interested in the history of their own countries. They're interested in cliches. So they're interested in, once again, I apologize, but they're interested in Magellan. They probably don't even know what he did or where he went, but they know the name. They may know the name of Fernando Pessoa. They may know the name of Fernando Pessoa, but they've probably only read one or two poems. So I'm sorry to say that most people aren't interested in the history of their countries. We know that in America, make America great again, right? So we're going to make America great like it was before the end of slavery when Black people had no rights. Or we'll make America great like it was in the 1910s when women couldn't vote. Or we'll make America great again like in the 1930s when Lindbergh almost ran for president under a Nazi party line. So people
or,
don't understand.
or all of the above, possibly.
All of the above. So people, I'm sad to say, it's one of my battles that I fight constantly in writing about Portuguese history, is to get people. I mean, I find history fascinating. I adore history. I adore particularly how did people lead their daily lives. You know, when the novel I just finished is set in Castelo Rodrigo in 1680. How did people live there? What did they eat? How did they build their houses? How did they travel? What did coaches? How far could you go in a coach each day? Were coaches drawn by donkeys or horses? There's 1,000 questions that I want answers to, and I love that. And I wish there was a way of making history exciting to everyone, especially starting with kids who are 5 and 6 years old. Because if you get kids who are little interested in what daily life was like in ancient Greece, or in Rome, or in medieval Portugal, or in America when it was run by the Native Americans, if you can get a little kid interested in all that, he'll be interested in it forever.
Thank you, Richard. As we are getting closer, ever so closer, and I do want to see if we can get a couple of questions in.
Sure.
I just would like I would like to get your opinion on, from your observations of these last decades, where do you see the Portuguese literary scene go? How is it evolving? What are the changes you've seen? What are your hopes?
You know, when I first got to Portugal back in 1980 for a visit, I moved here in 1990 with Alex, my husband, but you'll remember, Deolinda, that the Portuguese bestseller list was unique. We had books that were selling well by really, really good local authors, and books that weren't always easy. And slowly it changed so that now the bestseller lists in Portugal and what sells reflect what's happening mostly in Britain, America, and France. So the same sorts of books like Danielle Steele, John Grisham, really, really terrible books, I'm sorry to say. And so what I've seen is a uniformization. It's a uniformization of what works, what sells to the Portuguese public. And that's disappointing. On the other hand, we have a younger generation of authors who were writing really well. A lot of them are women. Ana Margarida de Carvalho, Isabel Rio Novo. There's a whole list of people we can talk about who are writing books they feel passionate about. And maybe they don't sell as well as the other ones, but they win prizes and they sell pretty well, and they're going to keep publishing. And so I'm very hopeful that that things will keep. I'm not hopeful that the bestseller list will change. I think the commercial books will still be there and will sell most. But I'm hopeful that underneath that, there'll be a current of younger authors writing really beautiful books about things they care passionately about, and that they'll be able to get them published. I'm praying that we can keep having good publishers in Portugal and that it won't get worse. Because if big groups keep buying our publishers, it's going to get worse and worse. So I'm praying that we can still have Porta Editora and Relógio de Água and lots of other good publishers who take a chance on local and foreign authors who may not sell as well as the really, really bad authors from America, Britain, and France.
Thank you so much. I would, at this point, would like to ask my colleague Duarte to open up for questions, if there are any.
Yeah, we do have one question on chat. Let me check real quick, because I was actually chatting Richard all my suggestions on books about crime fiction. But we do have a chat here a question by Kate. Let me open the chat So it says, who are some other queer or anti-fascist Portuguese authors and artists we should know that were censored before the revolution? I think it's a question for both, for Deolinda and for
Yeah,
Richard.
I have to be really delicate because a lot of the queer authors in Portugal never came out of the closet.
Yes.
And so I'm a little nervous about outing them. The one who came out of the closet was Antonio Boto, who was a poet who wrote openly gay poetry. I translated some, I translated some of his, I know a lot of other gay authors, but I'm really hesitant to talk about them because they were very concerned about leaving a legacy in which no one would actually know what their sexuality was. So I don't know what to do. Deolinda,
and from a female perspective, Judith Teixeira is probably the one that comes to mind. But in her case, it did destroy her ability to publish completely. But as far as having books that were censored, it's not restricted to gay, lesbian authors. Just about everybody who wrote in Portugal had something censored at one point or another, some more than others. But, you know, Dali Correia had stuff, lots of things censored. Everybody did. Everybody who was writing, it was almost impossible. Well, there were some writers that were totally supportive of the regime, and they probably never wrote anything that would be censored. But the overwhelming majority of writers had some texts that were censored at one time or another.
Wouldn't you agree, Richard? Sorry to jump in. I was curious about the person that you, the poet that you opened the conversation that you refer was your friend, and he didn't use clearly or didn't express.
Yeah.
Was that Eugênio de Andrada by any chance?
Yeah, it was. Forgive me, Eugenio, but yeah, because Eugenio, I knew Eugenio pretty well, and he was very concerned that after he died, you know, maybe he wouldn't be as read as much if people got to know more about his personal life. And I understand that, you know, we're writers. What we do in our personal lives shouldn't have all that much to do with whether people like our books. You know, and he would go through his new editions of his books and cross out the dedications if they were to a man, because, you know, he didn't want to leave that understanding. And that was his right. You know, I don't like outing people. He had every right to stay in the closet if he wanted to. And it's just a little bit sad because he was a great poet. And, you know, Portugal's the kind of country where everybody knows who's sleeping with who's gay, who you know, who's cheating on their, you know, taxes, but people don't talk about it and they make believe they don't know.
Yeah.
But I think he's been outed before by literary critics.
I think so too.
So you're okay. You're forgiven.
I'm okay.
I'm sure.
I feel terrible.
Don't feel so bad. Yes, Duarte, is there anything else?
No, I actually have a question for Richard. If he ever thought about writing, because you wrote several books about, you're Jewish, and you wrote several books involving Jewish history. Have you ever thought about writing the situation of the Jewish during, because we're talking about the dictatorship in Portugal was not only just a right-wing dictatorship, so it was also a religious dictatorship.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about writing that particular situation of Jewish people during 50 years from 1926 to 1974? Or do you refer in any of your books?
Yeah, no, I haven't done it yet. In part because there were so few Jews in Portugal during the regime. And in part because I just haven't found the story I want to tell. You know, sometimes I just have to find the right story. But the regime was anti-Semitic. It's for instance, it's well known that refugees coming from Germany came through Porto and Lisbon in order to get to the New World, to Brazil and to America. And that was wonderful, of course, that they could get here. But what's less known, for instance, is that Salazar wouldn't let them work. He wouldn't let them get jobs. So that how could they stay here very long unless they found someone to sponsor them and to keep them alive, fed and housed. And so these were, and it's curious because Salazar didn't want these people around, not just because they were Jews, but because they came with modern habits. These women from Germany would go to the cafes by themselves. They wouldn't go with a man, or they would go to the movie theater by themselves. And so he didn't want this. And another thing he did to prevent these horrible foreigners from bringing their modern habits to Portugal was he would separate them. He would send a family to Ericeira. He would send another family up to Coimbra. He would keep them separate so that they couldn't have such a big influence on any one place.
Yes, Duarte, do you have anything else?
I don't have anything else on the Bate-Papo if you would like to. Before we go.
I have an interesting story about what happened. I happened to work with a woman in San Francisco who was Polish. And maybe that her story is the story you're waiting for. But her family was, they began to understand that they were going to be shipped to the concentration camps. So one of her sisters had made it to Portugal because her husband was a consul. Mm-hmm. So her mother shipped her and two of her siblings in crates in a freight train. She built crates for them, put food and water in the crates and shipped them to Lisbon to be picked up by the sister who lived in Lisbon. And can you just imagine, think the woman, and her name was Aida. She then came to Lisbon, but they were placed. Her sister, everybody else were placed in the farol, in the thing we have in the middle of the Tejo River. So they were placed in that military structure, and from there they went out to a ship that took them to Argentina. Wow. So we ended up working together in San Francisco because then she married an Argentinian who was also a consul general, got assigned to Canada. And then from Canada, he came to the United States. He happened to die when he was here, and they had a child who was already born here. So then she ended up staying here, meaning the United States. So it was a long way, but her story was absolutely fascinating, fascinating, because her view of Portugal was totally, and she was not, what was interesting to me was that she was not insulted by the fact that basically Portugal allowed her to come in, but then they tossed her out and she didn't see it that way. She still saw it as being benefactors because they didn't send her back to the concentration camps where the rest of her family perished. Only the ones who, the three siblings that got shipped and the other one that was already there survived. Everybody else perished. So it was interesting that somebody who went through what we feel is a total despair felt that this was a good thing in a way. So, but I would never thought that you could even spend the night in that fort, but apparently you can, because these people were there until the small boats would come in to pick them up and then take them through the South Pacific route. That's why they all ended up in either southern Brazil or Argentina, because they could only use the southern Atlantic route. So I just thought I would share that story with you.
I have one more question for Richard, if he allows me. World lives a little. I have this question because I'm following up this current subject about Ukraine, and I'm my wife is Ukrainian, Richard. So I follow I follow very close this subject. How do you feel like, for having lived these moments? We all live these moments of, I didn't, but live these moments of dictatorships, right? And
Yeah.
you live these several turbulent facts in United States and also in Portugal. How do you feel about the current wars? For instance, this one in Ukraine happening, like it feels like it's the second, or like, I'll just say it's like dictatorship is coming back again. Like we never learn with these mistakes, at least Western civilization, we never learn mistakes we did in history, and we keep repeating them to the exhaustion. How do you feel about this
Well,
Go ahead.
like almost everyone except the part of the Communist Party in Portugal, I feel outraged and upset, and a great deal of compassion and solidarity and empathy with the Ukrainian people. About the historical aspect, the famous line is that if we don't learn from history, we're condemned to repeat it, and I think that's very true. And if you're old enough to know, like me, I'm 66 years old. So I lived through the Vietnam War, which was America's Vietnam War, which is a colossal, immoral enterprise that killed at least 1 million Vietnamese people and 58,000 American soldiers, and did nothing to make the world a better place. And then, of course, you have the Iraq wars. We were going in there because they had weapons of mass destruction, but of course they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. And we were going in there to make them democracies. And of course we didn't make them democracies. Everything just got worse and worse and worse. And so there's a lot of lessons there, but as you say, Duarte, people don't seem willing to learn them. I remember when George Bush started his war in Iraq with the help of Durão Barroso and Tony Blair. 3 weeks after the war began, he stood on an American aircraft carrier and said, the war's over. We've just won the war and everybody's to be congratulated. 3 weeks. And that war continued for, I don't know, it's still going on. So it's been 12, 15, 20 years of hundreds of thousands of civilians dying. And Vladimir Putin probably believed that in 3 weeks, he could control all of the Ukraine. It isn't that easy. And you would think that people would learn lessons, that you don't attack other countries and invade other countries and think that the people there are going to welcome you with open arms and it's all going to be easy and the world is going to, it doesn't happen anymore. Thankfully, we have the news people. They're not wonderful, but we know what's going on in the Ukraine. That wasn't possible in the 17th and 18th century. But now we know what's going on. We have films, we have photographs, we have testimonies every day on TV. And I think that does make a difference when people see Mariupol and Bucha completely destroyed, and orphans, and parents writing the names of their children on their skin in case they're made orphans. People just want it to stop. And it's such a depressing thing to me as a historical novelist to realize that maybe human beings are just too ignorant and stupid to learn from history, and we're condemned to go through these wars all the time. And I have no solution except that we have to, the 25 de Abril, the 25th of April, happened in 1974, but it didn't just happen in 1974. It's every day. Every day, all of us need to fight to continue the revolution, to make it more just, more egalitarian, more human, more empathetic, more solidarity, to give women, Blacks, non-binary people, everyone, more options in life. And we can each participate in that. And so in a sense, that's hopeful. All of us can participate in making the world a more compassionate and wonderful place for everyone. And we just have to keep fighting people like Putin, and keep fighting people like Orban, and keep fighting people like Donald Trump. And if we don't keep fighting them, then they're going to run the world. So there's not much of a choice.
Thank you for the question.
I always say that to me, totalitarianism or dictatorship is sort of like a drug addiction. Even when you overcome it, you still have to say no every single day of your life.
Yep.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
That's a good comparison. I don't know if you have more questions, Deolinda.
I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I would like to conclude by thanking Richard enormously. He's been extremely generous to Berkeley and to me, and I appreciate your generosity tremendously. Could never put it into words, the degree of our appreciation for what you do and for how you always collaborate with us. And we do wish everyone in Portugal a wonderful celebration. And beyond that, we hope that the light of liberty and human dignity reaches every corner of the world, because that's the only way humans can flourish and become what we're meant to be fully. Once again, Feliz 25 de Abril to everyone. And thank you to everyone involved and everyone present.
Thank you, Richard, as well. And thank you to our sponsors as well, Deolinda Camões, Vlad, Cátedra.
Of course.
And thank you so much, Richard, for your words and your experience. You're amazing. Thank you so much. Happy Carnation Revolution to all. And see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Obrigado.